If you're preparing for the Databricks Data Engineer Associate certification, there's one topic you absolutely must understand: Delta Lake. Because many exam questions are based on ACID transactions, the transaction log, and how Delta Lake ensures reliable data pipelines. But here's the problem. Most explanations of Delta Lake are overly complicated. So in this video, I'll explain Delta Lake in the simplest way possible. What is Delta Lake? Let's start with a simple definition. Delta Lake is an open-source storage layer that brings reliability to data lakes. It does this by adding a transactional layer on top of data stored in cloud storage. Now, why is this important? Because traditional data lakes were designed for scalability, not reliability. They can store massive amounts of raw data, but they often suffer from problems like inconsistent data, partial writes, and corrupted tables. Delta Lake solves these problems by adding a transactional layer on top of your data. Important concept for the exam. Now here's something very important to remember. Delta Lake is not a storage format. This is a common misunderstanding. The actual data inside Delta tables is usually stored in Parquet files. Delta Lake simply adds an additional management layer that handles transactions, metadata, and reliability. Think of it like a smart management system for your data lake. Why Delta Lake exists? To understand why Delta Lake exists, we need to talk about something called ACID transactions. ACID stands for atomicity, consistency, isolation, durability. These principles ensure that data operations are reliable and complete. But traditional data lakes do not support ACID transactions, which means several problems can occur. For example, partial data writes, corrupted tables, inconsistent reads. Imagine a data pipeline writing millions of records, and the job fails halfway through. Without ACID support, your table could be left in a broken state. Delta Lake prevents this. It guarantees that a transaction either fully succeeds or it does not happen at all. Where Delta Lake runs. Another reason Delta Lake is powerful is because it works perfectly with cloud object storage. It integrates seamlessly with platforms like Amazon S3, Azure Data Lake Storage, Google Cloud Storage. This makes Delta Lake a perfect fit for modern lakehouse architectures. The most important component, transaction log. Now let's talk about the most important component of Delta Lake, the Delta transaction log. This is the core technology that makes Delta Lake reliable. Whenever you create a Delta table, two things are created. First, the actual data files stored in Parquet format. Second, a transaction log stored inside a folder called _Delta log. This folder contains the history of the table. What the transaction log stores? The transaction log keeps an ordered record of every operation performed on the table. Each transaction is stored as a JSON file. These logs track things like data, inserts, updates, deletes, metadata changes, and file modifications. So essentially, the transaction log acts like a version control system for your data. How Delta Lake reads data now. Let's see how data is read from a Delta table. When a user queries a Delta table, Spark does not immediately read the data files. Instead, it first checks the transaction log. The transaction log tells Spark which files represent the latest valid version of the table. Let's imagine a simple scenario. Alice writes new data to the table. At the same time, Bob runs a query. Spark first reads the transaction log, identifies the valid data files, and then reads those files. This ensures that Bob always gets consistent data. How Delta Lake handles updates. Here's another very important concept for the certification exam. Parquet files are immutable. This means once a file is written, it cannot be modified. So when you update data in a Delta table, Delta Lake does not change the original file. Instead, it follows a simple process. First, it creates a new file with the updated data. Second, it updates the transaction log. Third, it marks the old file as inactive. This design enables powerful features like historical data versions, data lineage tracking, and the ability to roll back to previous versions. Concurrent reads and writes. Another major advantage of Delta Lake is support for concurrent operations. This means multiple users can read and write data at the same time. For example, one data pipeline can be writing new data, while analysts are still safely querying the previous version of the table. This ensures no data corruption, no locking issues, and consistent queries. Key takeaway. So remember this key idea. The Delta transaction log is the backbone of Delta Lake. It tracks every change made to the table and ensures reliable, consistent data operations. In the next video, we'll explore some powerful Delta Lake features like time travel, optimize, and vacuum. These features are extremely useful in real data engineering pipelines. And they're also important topics for the Databricks certification exam. So make sure to check out the next video.